Very good. Thank you very much indeed. Good morning, Ms. Caskey.
Good morning, my lord. I hope you're well.
Good. Very well, thank you very much indeed. We have two witnesses this morning, I understand.
Two,
Mr. Caskey?
yes.
Very good. Right, and I think the first one is it Miss Purdie? Yes.
Ms. Purdie.
Ms. Purdie, right. Good morning, Ms. Purdie.
Good morning.
Very good. When you're ready, Mr. Caskey.
Thank you, my lord. Would you tell the inquiry your full name, please?
Yeah, it's Amanda Purdie.
And the inquiry already has your contact details and date of birth and so on. You are here from which organisation?
I'm here from AMMA Birth Companions.
And can you just give us an indication what that organisation is about, just in general terms?
So AMMA Birth Companions provides practical and emotional support to people who are going through pregnancy and birth and parenthood alone or with very limited support. So a lot of the people that we work with are people who are in the asylum process or refugees, survivors of trafficking, and we provide support from them right from pregnancy through to early postpartum.
You're speaking quite quickly. Sorry. And we have a stenographer who's got to try and keep up. So can I ask you just to slow down a little? Are you employed by the organisation?
Yes.
And how long have you been employed?
I have been with the organisation since January 2020.
And do you have a job title?
Yeah, it's Head of Advocacy and Communications.
And what does that involve?
So I oversee all of the communications with both internal and external stakeholders at AMMA, and I also get involved with strategic advocacy. So
you're one of the organisations who's involved with another organisation called Refugees for Justice. Was there a particular issue that brought you and Refugees for Justice together?
Yes, so that was primarily in relation to the opening of the MERS Mother and Baby Unit in January 2021.
And I'll ask you, well, firstly, can you tell us who MERS are? We're going to be referring to them a few times today.
So MERS is the housing provider contracted by the Home Office in Glasgow.
And do they provide housing only in Glasgow?
Elsewhere as well, I believe, but I don't have a lot of information about that.
Okay. Are you essentially a Scottish organisation?
Yeah.
Yeah, good. You've provided us with a witness statement very helpfully, and that's in terms of our record keeping under reference SCI WT 0405 and then 501. You don't need to concern yourself with that. I'm looking at your witness statement just now, and you have that there, which is further on than there's an introduction in the paperwork and the background, and then if we move down in this, we come to the statement, which is on the next page. You see statement, and then it starts. Unfortunately, these aren't given paragraph numbers, but we'll work around that. I have already asked you about the first paragraph in your witness statement. The second paragraph I'm going to leave until later. But you then explain something of the history of the organisation in paragraph 3. Can you tell us about that?
Yes, so AMMA became operational as a charity in around May 2019. So we were fairly new at the time when lockdown first hit. We were pretty young into our service, but I suppose during that time we saw a huge demand for our service because people were so incredibly isolated and really needed that support probably more than ever.
At paragraph 4 of the witness statement, you provide a series of bullet points. Explaining something of what you did during lockdown. Again, are there matters within those bullet points that you would wish to highlight?
Sure, yeah. So during lockdown, we still continued to provide the types of practical and emotional support that we were set up to provide. So despite all of the restrictions and limitations around COVID, we felt that it was important for us to continue doing that work. So we continued to support people during birth. We were taking women to and from hospital appointments, and then providing support postnatally as well. A big part of what we were doing during that time was also just helping people to understand the situation. There were a lot of people who were feeling quite anxious and distressed about COVID, who maybe had language barriers and didn't fully understand the guidelines and the risk limitation measures that were in place. So we did a lot of, just trying to help people understand that. And I think, generally we were, I suppose, quite focused on the emotional needs of people during that time, because as everyone was, there was a lot of isolation, but particularly for the people that we were supporting who were already isolated before this began, we saw a huge rise, I guess, in mental health needs. So we were doing a lot around that.
Paragraph 4, you provide, I think, 5 bullet points. Do they represent the core functions of the organisation during the lockdown period?
Yes, I suppose I would just expand maybe on some of the practical support, just to say that we also, at that time, were doing a lot to provide transport to and from appointments, so making sure that people could take taxis to avoid having to take public transport. And then we were also providing support with phones and mobile data so that people could get online.
Okay, well, I'll come back to that and its importance. In terms of the organisation's function, why was it decided that there needed to be a particular organisation concentrating on asylum-seeking new mothers? What was the philosophy behind that?
So it grew out of a project that was originally within the British Red Cross in Glasgow. So that was called the Mums Project, and that project still exists in a form to support mothers who are in the asylum process. And I think, so our co-founder, Sarah Zadek, she worked as part of that project and could see that there was a need not just to support people around birth, but to actually go to birth and be present. But there wasn't enough capacity within that service to do that. So Sarah decided she would set up her own project and train people to become companions who would then go on to support people at birth.
In the witness statement at paragraph 6, you refer to a change. Paragraph 5, you refer to a change that happened in January 21. Now, I'll ask you about after the change, but can you tell me what was happening before January 21?
In what?
In the sense of where were new and expectant mothers living and so on.
Yeah, so most of the people that we were supporting prior to January 2021 were in flats, in kind of self-contained flats, and we would provide support in the home.
And in January 2021, you said that there was a move. Tell us about just the physical move, what happened.
So in January 2021, we became aware that around 20 expectant and new mothers who were in the asylum process were being moved to the unit that I referenced earlier, so the mother and baby unit that was opened by Amir's group.
Okay, and when they were in flats, and I'll try to differentiate when in flats and when in the mother and baby unit, when they were in flats, how were they financially supported?
Through their asylum support.
And do you know how much that is?
I think at the time it was roughly £37 a week, maybe, or 38.
And was that paid for each person in the household?
Yes.
So that when a mother was about to give birth, she would be receiving £37 a week, and then when the child was born, she would get another £37 a week in addition. When the move happened, I'll ask you about where they moved to in a moment, but when the move happened, how did the financial position alter?
I believe it stayed the same. I don't think their asylum support changed when they moved.
Okay. Tell me about the accommodation that they were moved to.
So they were moved to a unit that was, prior to that, it was a homeless accommodation for single men, I believe. And it was, I think, originally a church that had been converted into these 37 bedsit style accommodations.
Now, the women who were in the flats, had they, in general, been there for a while, or were they recent arrivals into the flats?
It was a mix. So I think we spoke to about 15 different people at one point, and we asked them, what their situations were before. I believe there were 2 of those 15 who had been living in hotels and were quite recently arrived, but there was then a mix of people who had actually lived in flats for a year in some cases. So, people who were quite settled in their accommodation prior to being moved.
And being pregnant and in accommodation for up to a year, had they built up community network supports?
Yes, absolutely. So many of the people we spoke to at the time said that actually they felt much more isolated being moved into this unit because they had built up supportive networks in their local areas, and then again, because of COVID restrictions and visiting, it was actually impossible for them to maintain those networks.
Tell me about how many or how much accommodation was there in this mother and babies unit?
There were 37 bedsits.
And you said that it had previously been for homeless people. Mm-hmm. Do you know why, or have you been told why it closed?
Yes.
As a homeless persons unit?
Mm-hmm. So at the time, I submitted a Freedom of Information request and actually obtained a report from the Health and Social Care Partnership
of Glasgow City Council.
Yes, yeah. That talked about the decommissioning of that building, and essentially the focus was that the rooms were far too small for people to be comfortably accommodated for any length of time. The building itself was in need of a lot of repair, so essentially it was deemed to be unsuitable.
Before it was turned into a mother and baby unit, were the required repairs carried out?
I'm not sure. I know there was refurbishments to the rooms, so the rooms themselves were fairly modern, had new fixtures and fittings and that kind of thing. The building itself, I couldn't see any signs of updating, so I'm not sure.
Okay. I understand that it was at that time that your organisation and Refugees for Justice came together. Mm-hmm. And at that time, you ran a particular campaign about the mother and baby unit. Did that have a catchline, a tag?
It did, yes. The tag was freedom to crawl. Freedom to crawl.
Freedom to crawl. Okay, let's dig into that a little bit. Tell me about the rooms that women were located in.
So they varied in size, but I would say they were all small. They were all very small, some extremely small. And I think what they all had in common was just very, very little space for children to play or move around, to crawl, hence the tagline. So they were incredibly tiny. They had, very minimal furnishings, very little storage space. They had kitchenettes that were, part of the room, but it was all kind of open plan, so there was no way to differentiate, between spaces. So we saw rooms that were incredibly crowded, where cots were within inches of cookers or radiators. Really, there was no more room than, a single bed and a cot and then the kitchen.
What furnishings were in the rooms?
So when it first opened, there was a small chest of drawers. There was a fold-out metal chair, a bed, and then cots for people who needed them. And that was about it.
Was there a chair suitable for breastfeeding?
No. No. So that was one of the things we were speaking to Mears about, was that it was really important that more comfortable seating be arranged.
And did that change? Did Mears listen?
Yeah, I think in time, some women anyway, were provided with slightly more comfortable chairs, but because of the space, you couldn't really get, an armchair or anything big, but it was slightly more comfortable than a fold-out chair.
You said there was a kitchenette. Did it have a fridge?
It had a fridge, but no freezer.
Was there an extractor?
No, there was no extractor.
Tell me about the windows, so far as you recall.
So the windows were like sash-style windows, so they only opened a tiny crack because they were blocked at the top. So they only opened, probably the length of a credit card. And because there was no extractor fan, it just meant that the ventilation in the room was really, really poor. Was there a fire alarm in the room? So the fire alarm, I think in most rooms, was kind of between the cooker and the window. So it meant that any cooking fumes tended to set off the fire alarm. So there were frequent fire alarms.
And did you receive, how frequent?
I couldn't say for sure. I know there was a period of time when they seemed to be happening almost daily. But yeah, I'm not sure.
Okay. At paragraph 9 in your witness statement, you talk about the decisions being made to move women into the unit. Now, what I don't want to do is go into the basis upon which it was decided by Mears and the Home Office that this move would take place. That's almost certainly a matter exclusively for the Westminster Government and therefore is not within our terms of reference. However, you provide 4 bullet points in relation to paragraph 9. You talk firstly about women already being in communities before the move occurred. Was it difficult for women to move because of that?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, as I said earlier, there were certainly people who had been living in flats for some period of time and had started to establish local connections or at least familiarize themselves with the local area, and so had started to feel a little bit more settled, a little bit more integrated, and then were told without very much notice at all that they would be moved to this new accommodation. So it was quite upsetting for people.
You say not very much notice at all. Can you tell me a bit more about that?
Yeah, so again, of the people that we surveyed, those 15 people that I mentioned, I think there was really, I would say the majority of people had a week's notice, maybe a little bit more than that in some cases, but a week or less that they were told they'd be moving into this unit.
Do you know from your survey or other knowledge whether or not the women who were being moved, were they interviewed to identify any particular vulnerabilities?
No.
They weren't?
They were not, no.
Okay, in the second bullet point you quote from Scottish Government guidance. Could you just read that to us?
Yeah, so at the time, the Scottish Government's guidance on moving house stated, at this time, it is advisable to postpone viewings of properties or delay a home move where this is possible.
So you have women in settled accommodation who are being moved despite the Scottish Government guidance. You talk in the next paragraph about women being told they can only bring 2 bags. These are women who have lived in a flat for a year. Did that present a difficulty?
Yeah, absolutely. So, particularly for people who had been living, in accommodation for a length of time, they'd acquired things that they needed for themselves, their babies. Oftentimes those things were acquired through donations, and it's financially quite difficult, I suppose, to get these things. So to be told that you could then only bring a couple of bags or 1 case and have to leave behind those items was incredibly distressing.
So what happened to the things that they weren't able to take?
It's a bit unclear. I think for some, they said they never got those things back. I don't know if that was the case for everyone, but certainly I know of a few cases where those belongings never turned up.
Did you spend time in any of these rooms, with or without women, the tenants being present?
Yes, I spent a lot of time there.
Can you describe what they were like in terms of how crowded were they?
Incredibly crowded. It's kind of hard to even explain in words, but yeah, because of the lack of storage, oftentimes when you were going in, the stuff would just be stacked up against the walls because, as you can imagine, when you've got babies, you have a lot of equipment, you need nappies and clothes and things. So people were kind of forced to stack stuff up against the walls. As I said, the cots were often just crammed in between something, whether it was a cooker or the bed, or there was very, very little space around the cot. There was very little floor space. The ceilings in some of the rooms were quite low and dark. So, I heard some women talk about it as if it was a prison, like they felt very kind of claustrophobic in the room. And because of the lack of ventilation, it was, it definitely it didn't have a nice feel to it. It felt very oppressive.
Very oppressive. Mm-hmm. Okay. In the final bullet point, you talk about what appears to be an indication or rule that women shouldn't be moved 6 weeks before birth and 6 weeks after birth. Yeah. Where do you think that comes from?
That's the Home Office guidance.
Right, so there should have been no moves 6 weeks either side of the birth. Was there?
There was, yeah. So we know of at least a few people who were moved with less than 6 weeks before their due date, and then some that were moved, well, at least one was moved, at least one was moved within days after giving birth.
Now, we've spoken a lot about the place that they were moving to and the place that they had come from. We haven't yet spoken really about COVID, and that's where I want to go next. At the point at which people were moved into the mother and baby unit, was any COVID testing done?
No.
And was that the situation even when COVID tests became more freely available?
As far as I know, yeah, I don't think it was anything that was enforced at the unit. I think people were maybe offered tests if they wanted them, but I can't say for certain.
Right. And having visited the unit on a number of occasions, was social distancing practically a possibility?
No. No, it wasn't.
Tell me why.
Because around the rooms, the rooms were sort of along the perimeter, and then there was communal areas just outside of the rooms where there were sofas, and so naturally a lot of people would congregate in these areas because their rooms were so small. And also, because there was no space to hang washing, a lot of people ended up using that area to hang their washing. So it was a very, very busy, crowded space, kind of just outside of everybody's rooms. And then on top of that, there were shared washing facilities. So again, if you wanted to do laundry, you would often be in the laundry room with several others. So it was very, very difficult to socially distance.
So I want to ask you about some features about the women who were there. Obviously, all of the women who were there were either just about to give birth or had just given birth. Was there particular guidance for pregnant and recently unpregnant women at the time in relation to COVID? There
was, yeah. So at the time, pregnant women and people who were newly postpartum were considered at increased risk of becoming quite unwell with COVID, so particularly those in the third trimester or people who had recently given birth. And I believe there was also some guidance at the time that was specific to Black and Asian populations that was saying those populations were at even more increased risk, so needed to be quite careful.
And what were the, in your experience, what were the percentage of women in the unit who were Black and Asian?
All. 100%, yeah.
Right. Weren't any Albanians, for example?
Maybe, but not that I worked with, but potentially.
Right. So you, towards the end of that page, in the first bullet point, you talk about NHS guidance, 3 lines from the bottom. Can you tell us about that?
Sure. Would you like me to read it? Yeah. So it says, pregnant women should follow the latest government guidance on staying alert and safe and avoid anyone who has symptoms suggestive of COVID-19. If you're in your 3rd trimester, so more than 28 weeks pregnant, you should be particularly attentive to social distancing.
And in your view, was it possible for women resident in the mother and baby unit to firstly self-isolate? Was that possible for women who were there?
You could self-isolate, but I think the people that I knew who were making attempts to self-isolate, the people who were especially cautious about COVID, found that incredibly difficult on their mental health, because the rooms, as I say, were so small. So if you were in that room for any length of time, it did really start to affect people's mental health. So I think a lot of people in the end kind of gave up on the notion of trying to isolate because it was too difficult.
And in terms of the women moving in, there's a particular guidance in relation to women who are in the 3rd trimester. Would all of the women be in the 3rd trimester when they moved in?
No, so some were, but some had recently given birth, and then some actually had children who were, even up to 8 months old by that point.
And were there any women who had older children, someone who had a child and then went in to have a second child? Did that happen?
No, not that I'm aware of.
Okay. So it was all first-time mothers?
Yeah, people who were at least giving birth for the first time in the UK, yeah.
Okay. Sorry, yes, of course, because they may have had children before they arrived. At the end of that section, you talk about cleaning and household resources. Can you just tell us about that?
Yeah, so there initially was women had to share cleaning supplies. So there were 2 brooms, 2 mops, 2 ironing boards, and 1 iron that were shared amongst the residents. So again, in time, I think that changed with some advocacy with MERS, but initially that was the case.
So that was it for all 37 units?
Well, so all 37 units weren't full, so that was for about 20 people who were living there.
So you have women who are in the final stages of pregnancy or who have just given birth. How long would they stay in the unit after they had given birth?
So when it first opened, people were told that they would be living there until their child was 2. That changed over time, I think, to 1. But it's hard to say how long people did end up living there. So my understanding is that there was some indication from MERS, I think in November 2021. I'm just looking at my notes, but yeah, that they intended to move the women out, women with babies out into self-contained accommodation. But then when the report that was released by the Children and Young People's Commissioner came out in March, they still had yet to do that. So I think, any time from kind of March onwards, it's hard to say when people were moved out, but they certainly lived there for at least.
Just as we're talking about that just now, is it still open?
It's still open, but it doesn't house mothers and babies anymore.
Right, do you know when that ended?
Well, the last person that we supported was actually last summer. So we supported someone who was pregnant, I think in August last year in 2023, but she hadn't given birth yet. So I'm not sure when the last person moved out, but.
Okay. Now, you've spoken about the facilities that were available in the room, and these rooms were specifically designed for women in the lead-up to their birth experience and then in the aftermath of that for several weeks and months. And the plan was that they might be there for initially up to 2 years and then for a year.
Yeah.
Did they have TVs in the room?
No, they did not.
So what entertainment facility was there?
There was nothing. So they did not have TVs, they didn't have Wi-Fi. Towards the end, I know they had opened up a kind of communal room, which I think did have a TV. But again, that was a communal space, so a lot of people were reluctant to use that.
Right, and for women at that point in their life, is that not being able to access distraction, is that important?
Yeah, yes, definitely. I think especially during lockdown and during COVID, it would have been one of the only things to do, really. So they were very bored. Yeah.
And was that something that was entirely predictable in your view?
Yes.
Did that have an impact on mental health? I'll ask you about mental health in more detail in a minute, but just that single issue, did that have an impact on mental health?
I think the boredom really affected people. I think it, particularly when you're pregnant or when you've, as many of them had experienced trauma, you have nothing to distract you, and so you're sitting just with your thoughts, and I think that can be very difficult for people.
So all of these women were asylum seekers, so they all claimed in terms of the law that they feared persecution if they returned.
That's right, yeah.
In your experience, were many of them previously traumatised?
Yes.
Okay, you talk then at the heading Impact on Pregnant Women and New Mothers, and you talk about impacts. And you talk there about fire alarms going off, and you've already spoken about that, signing in and out of the building. Tell me about that, about freedom to enter and exit the building.
Yes, so initially, again, when it first opened, it was actually a buzzer system. So the women themselves didn't even have full access to the building. They had to buzz to be let in.
They didn't put a fob?
They did eventually. They put a key entry, I think. But initially, for at least the first couple of months, it was a buzzer system. So that in itself felt very controlling, and I think a lot of women felt as if they were being monitored, and kind of likened it to being in detention. So that was very difficult for them just to even get in and out of the building. And then in terms of people accessing the building, so they allowed visitors to come in for 2 hours at a time, but it had to be essential support workers, so the likes of AMMA, health visitors, NHS staff, and other support organizations. And then fathers could visit, but again, only for 2 hours at a time, so it was quite strict around visitation.
Tell me about any other impacts.
Around coming and going, or?
Yeah, around living there.
Yeah, I think...
apart from mental health, we'll just go into mental health.
So not mental health. Yeah, I think it just wasn't an environment that was in any way appropriate for mothers and babies. Even just having to go up and down the stairs, there was a lot of stairs. There was... to do your laundry, you had to go into a separate room. And so people who, for example, have just had a C-section, it's going to be very difficult for them to have to carry their laundry, carry their new baby into a shared laundry facility. There was a rota for the laundry, so it was very complicated. And, I think it just led to a lot of unnecessary stress and tension for people who were in quite a critical phase of their lives in terms of having just given birth.
What about your access to the place? Did you always have to buzz in?
Yeah, we did, yeah.
Okay. We're going to hear evidence later today, I think, of people who are saying that they could just freely enter from other organisations.
Yeah, I think in time the restrictions relaxed probably too much in some ways. I think there was a period of time where it felt as if you could just walk in and nobody was sort of watching. So there were, towards, the end of my time that I would have been supporting people in there, we actually saw people who were kind of concerned about their safety and the fact that there were people who just seemed to come and go, and they weren't sure who they were.
Okay. And the population inside the unit, you said earlier they had experience of, they had reasons to leave their home country. The fact that effectively, any security system broke down, did that impact on women?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, a lot of the people that we were supporting at the time were people who had recently escaped from trafficking situations, so they felt incredibly vulnerable. And I think we certainly, as an organisation, had some concerns that some of those women were perhaps still kind of within trafficking situations or very vulnerable to potentially being re-trafficked. And we were really concerned that traffickers were learning about this unit and potentially realizing that there was a population of women in there who were quite vulnerable.
You then say something in the next section about mental health impact. Can you tell us about that, please? What were the mental health impacts you saw?
I think we saw people who were just very, very distressed. I think that's the word I would use to describe it. There were people who, I think had been maybe misled into what they thought they were going to. There were some people who were told, oh, you're being moved to a one-bedroom accommodation and it's a great supportive environment with lots of other new mothers. And I think when they arrived and realized actually what it was, they felt very upset about the prospect of being in this place for 2 years. We also saw people who, for safety reasons, really did not want to be in an environment where they were with people from their home countries. And that was, quite clear within their asylum claims that it would be very important for them to not be associating with other people from the same country. So there was no kind of regard for that. I think, and then I suppose just the whole experience of being pregnant and giving birth does generally have an impact on people's mental health, or can have. So this was just really heightened. It was very, very difficult, I think, for people to recover from birth in a safe and supportive way. That isolation that they were experiencing was very extreme. So some people, I remember one woman describing it as a pressure cooker, just feeling as if you've got all these women living together who, although there was some sense of community maybe, for certain people, I think a lot of people felt as if actually it was very distressing and tense. And there was a lot of friction.
I'm sorry about my cough.
It's okay.
I want to move on. As part of your campaigning work, your organisation wrote to mayors, and that document can be found as Exhibit 3 in the statement of the next witness that we're going to be hearing from. And that should come up on the screen for you. At the top, we can see The letter's dated 16th February 2021, and it's addressed to the Mears Group. If we can go to the end of that letter, it's quite a long letter.
It's a long letter, yeah.
We can see who's signed it off. Who is that?
That was me.
And I now want to go back to the top of the letter and take you through just a few particular points within it. If we can go down to the first set of bullet points and go to the second last one on that page, which starts many women. Tell us about that. I'll read that.
So yes, that's when, I'll just read it. Many women were told they could only bring 2 bags with them, including their baby equipment, apart from their cot and pram, and their clothes. So many women were forced to leave behind food and other essential items, resulting in a loss of belongings acquired over time by women with limited financial support.
You say over the page, under a heading COVID-19, at the first bullet point, people moving into the unit are not being tested for COVID-19 and do not have to quarantine. There are no measures in place to prevent mixing with other households. Many residents feel very anxious about the potential for a COVID-19 outbreak, particularly because of the shared spaces, because shared spaces are often overcrowded. Does that reflect, so this is you telling Mears about concerns that you've already expressed to us?
That's right.
Today?
Yeah.
Okay, now you talk about living conditions further down, and there are a series of bullet points. In my notes, I've marked every one. But rather than have you read them all out, can you just tell me what you consider to be the major concerns in relation to living conditions?
I think the main concern was the size of the rooms, and just, yeah, the fact that they were just so small, and the impact that this had on not only the women but also their babies and their babies' development.
Okay, and that continues over the page. And then there's residents' well-being. You talk about a woman being prescribed antidepressant medication. Do you, with your knowledge and experience, relate that to the particular living conditions that woman faced?
Yes, that's certainly how she described it to us. So she shared that with us, and she said that it was directly as a result of the stress of the move.
You talk about feelings of anxiousness because of locks on the doors. Again, can you tell us about that?
Yeah, so again, this was written right at the start when it opened, so I think that this did change over time, but initially there were no locks on the doors on individual rooms, so people couldn't even lock the door from the inside. So what was happening was people were walking in and out of rooms, without asking, so there were some people who were finding that incredibly anxiety-provoking.
Now, the next part of the letter is a table where you talk about Schedule 2 requirements and then areas of concern. Tell me about Schedule 2. What is that?
So these are the Home Office guidelines around asylum seekers.
And on the left-hand side, you list the requirements in Schedule 2, one of which is that vulnerability assessments should be carried out, and you say that they weren't. And Mears were quite upfront about that. They said they hadn't carried it out. Yeah. Can you tell me about that?
Yeah, so I suppose it's just that, yeah, they should have been done. people.
They were saying they should have been
we
done.
We were saying they should have been done because, yeah, there was no, it didn't seem like any consideration had been given for individual circumstances. So, you know, the example I mentioned earlier of people maybe not wanting to be housed in the same environment as someone from their home country, things like that were never considered. It didn't seem to be any kind of criteria for why people would be moved in.
Okay. Over the page, just before the heading living conditions, you say that there was an obligation, a requirement, that a provider would act sensitively with compassion and respect, because there is a recognition that users may have suffered trauma, be suspicious or frightened of authority figures, and be afraid of other service users and strangers. You've spoken a bit about that in your evidence. Do you think that was respected and applied?
No.
That requirement?
No. So I think that requirement relates specifically to housing providers, and so what we were aware of was when people were told by their housing officers that they would be moved. This was rarely, if ever, done in a trauma-informed or compassionate manner. I think a lot of people very much saw that as a more of a threat, and I know certainly there was at least one person who was threatened with deportation if she refused to move.
Right. Okay, can we move on over onto the next page? At the top of the next page, facilities include, and then there's a reference to washing machines, and you say something about that in the box on the right at the top of that page.
Yes, so there were 4 washing machines available for the entirety of the unit, so for 37 flats, or 37 bed sits. But over time, actually, 2 of those broke. So in the end, I think there were only 2 working washing machines. So laundry was a very difficult thing for people to do. I think, as I mentioned earlier, there was a rota in place, so people had to sign up to do their laundry on a certain day. And if you've just had a baby, that's very difficult. So yeah, the laundry, I know, caused a lot of tension and fighting, you know, in some cases between women.
If you move down to the box just above relocation, so kitchen fit out, again, you make comments on that. Could you tell us in your own words?
Yes, so the kitchen, as I said, had been, you know, the rooms had been refurbished, so they were modern enough, but there was very, very little cupboard space. You know, I think from memory, maybe 1 or 2 small cupboards. There was no freezer space, so this was difficult, again, for mums who, you know, maybe were expressing breast milk and wanted somewhere to store that, or who wanted to store, you know, food for their babies or make food in advance to have after they'd just given birth. So there was nowhere to put any of that. And it also meant that they could only do very small amounts of shopping at a time. So that meant that they had to go to shops often, which, again, during that time, there was guidance around trying to reduce the number of times that you were visiting shops.
Now, if we go over the page again, these boxes have reference numbers at the left-hand side. Can I go to C29? 2.9, that one. That's saying users should be provided with 7 calendar days notice. Was that complied with?
No.
What was your experience of that?
So we were told by MERS that letters had been sent to each of the mothers about their relocation, and that those letters should have gone out, you know, with adequate time. But the reality was that a lot of the moms said they never received those letters, and the letters that were received weren't dated, so there was no kind of accountability around when those were actually sent. So yeah, people were getting those notices very, very very quickly, if at all. So one of the mothers said she received hers just the day before she was moved, and another was 5 days. So it was not the 7 calendar days that is meant to be in place.
Okay, can I go to the bottom of that page and the right-hand box, which begins in response to a freedom of information request? Is this your freedom of information request that you gave us evidence about before?
That's right, yeah.
And again, you make a quotation there about why the premises had been decommissioned. Could you begin by reading, well, the two quotations? Could you read those?
Mm-hmm. So the report from Glasgow's Health and Social Care Partnership outlined the reasons why the James Shield project was decommissioned. It describes the rooms as very small and basic and not aligned to supporting young people experience independent living or develop the skills required. It also states the building and physical layout has brought about a number of challenges over the years. It was not purpose-built for accommodation, and it was originally converted from a large church to bedsits in the 1980s.
Okay. Do you have any comment to make on what you said there?
I think that stood out for us at the time because it really, I guess, highlighted discrimination. It didn't seem right to us that a building that was, very recently decommissioned because of its size and because of the state of the building, deemed inappropriate for single men, then went on to be approved for use for mothers and babies. It just didn't make any sense.
Okay. Can we move down? There's a heading, COVID-19. You can move down to that, please, Walt. And there's a box again on the right-hand side in which you talk about no quarantine, no testing. That you spoke to us about earlier. This is in the letter going to Mears that was sent in February. After this letter was sent, was any system of quarantining or testing introduced as far as you're aware?
No, not that I'm aware of.
And again, if we can move down to a heading, perinatal and infant mental health, which is there. And again, the right-hand box, could you just read that?
There are already multiple contributing factors to high rates of perinatal mental health issues amongst this population. This experience has been incredibly distressing for many of the residents, including pregnant women and new mothers, which could negatively impact their children's development. Mears states the accommodation is meant to provide a sense of community. However, many residents were moved from communities where they already had established strong local connections with other parents. They now find themselves in a new environment surrounded by people they do not know or wish to know in some cases in the middle of a pandemic, in the middle of winter, when it is not possible to visit, next page. To visit friends or attend parenting groups. This is likely to deepen their sense of isolation. Many of the affected individuals had formed support bubbles prior to moving into the unit, and now they are not allowed visitors and thus can't receive support from people in their bubble.
Okay. The next box down, freedom of movement, you quote UNHCR and you make some comments in writing there. I don't think I need to get you to expand on that, unless you feel you have to.
No, I think it's just what I said previously, that the conditions for coming in and out of the building did make people feel as if they were being monitored, and that it felt more like a detention style accommodation. Okay,
can I go back to your witness statement? As I indicated, the statement's in two parts. There's background and then the actual statement, and it's the statement I'm looking for. And if we can go to paragraph 2 of the second paragraph, during the COVID pandemic. You see that? Could you read that paragraph?
During the COVID-19 pandemic, we saw firsthand how women and babies in the asylum process faced exacerbated inequalities and vulnerabilities. The pandemic highlighted pre-existing disparities in access to healthcare, mental health support, digital connectivity, and suitable accommodation. The pandemic also led to delays in asylum procedures, prolonging the uncertainty and insecurity faced by mothers wishing to build a solid foundation for their babies' futures.
Were those difficulties addressed or resolved before the mother and baby unit closed?
No, I would say no.
Those are all the questions I have for you. Is there anything that you want to say that we haven't already covered? You don't have to say it. I might have done my job properly.
No, I don't think so. I don't know if it's useful to talk about the experience of when there was COVID in the unit. So when someone did contract COVID, maybe just to expand on that a little bit. So there was an occasion where someone was tested positive for COVID. This was someone who didn't speak English, who was quite newly arrived to Glasgow and had recently given birth. So she tested positive for COVID, and we were quite, I guess, concerned about Mira's response to that, because when she tested positive, or it was actually one of our support workers was in visiting her after she'd given birth, and it was clear that this woman wasn't very well. So when she tested, she arranged to have a test, and at that time they weren't the quick tests. They were the ones that you had to wait for the response for. So we had informed Mears that this was happening, and that we wanted to be kind of kept informed about what had happened. And several days passed. We hadn't heard from Mears, but we'd heard kind of anecdotally that she had tested positive. So when we followed up with Mears, we said, you know, we're really concerned. We'd like to know what measures you're putting in place to support this woman, because now she needs to self-isolate. Are you helping her with laundry? Are you helping her with food? You know, what are you doing to kind of support her as she self-isolates? And also, why have you not informed us officially? You know, why have we kind of heard this through the grapevine that she tested positive? It should have come from you. Because it had an impact then on the support that we could provide in the unit, because we were a bit cautious then about going back in, and also we wanted to know, had they informed other people living in the unit? So I think we were concerned about the response because we felt that it was a bit dismissive of, you know, at that point, testing positive for COVID was a big deal. It was something that caused a lot of fear and anxiety for people, and we just didn't feel like they sort of gave us a suitable response to that. So in terms of not responding or not informing us that she tested positive, they said that should have happened through track and trace. And our point to that was, well, this woman doesn't speak English. If she was called by track and trace, she wouldn't have been able to even communicate with them. So it's possible that she was never even able to go through the track and trace procedure. The informing other residents, they hadn't done that. I think until we raised it and said, could you? And again, I don't think they told everybody. So some people knew, some people didn't. They never sufficiently responded around, you know, if there were supports in place to help this woman self-isolate. So we just kind of felt like the whole thing was swept under the rug a little bit.
One of the problems that a woman in that type of situation might well have faced would have been getting food.
Yeah,
going
exactly.
out to buy groceries.
Yeah.
What steps were put in place by Mears in that regard?
None that I'm aware of. My recollection at the time was that actually it was the mothers that ended up helping her and providing food and kind of leaving it on her doorstep or her, you know, just outside of her room. I don't believe that Mears ever did anything to support that.
Okay. I'm sure we'll get the opportunity to ask them about that. Thank you very much. I don't have anything else for you.
Okay. Thank you.
Ms. Purdie, that's all.
Okay.
Right, we're a bit ahead of schedule. I don't know, we're due to start again at 11:15 with the next witness. I'm not sure if that will be possible, but it's about 10:45 now. If we could start at 11 o'clock, that would be helpful, but if not, then we'll just start when we can manage.
I'll do what I can, my lord.
Thank you very much indeed. Now, good morning again, Mr. Caskey.
Good morning, my Lord. The next witness is Savan Qadir, who's with us in the room just now.
Good morning, Mr. Qadir.
Good morning, my Lord.
I will be going through Mr. Qadir's witness statement, and there are also a number of attachments to that. We've already dealt with one of those attachments in the previous witness, but I will refer to the other attachments. The witness statement reference number is SCI WT 0490, then 5 zeros and 1. Mr. Qadir, would you tell Lord Brailsford your full name, please?
Sure. My name is Savan Yasin Qadir.
And what is your country of origin?
I'm from Iraq. I'm Kurdistan part.
Sorry, the...
I'm originally Kurdish from...
Kurdish.
Yes.
How was your experience when you came to the United Kingdom? How did you seek to remain in the United Kingdom initially?
I came to the UK 2015. When I came, I claimed asylum straight away, the same day of arrival. And do you want me to go through the process, what has happened?
No, but ultimately, do you now have permission to remain in the United Kingdom? Were you recognised as a refugee?
No, I'm in a different type of visa. I've been recognised. I'm on a spouse visa.
A spouse visa?
Yes, that's correct.
Okay. Now, you appear here today in a professional capacity because of your job. What is your job?
So I just need to clarify this point. I just recently left, quite recently, Refugees for Justice. By the time that I given the statement, I was the project manager at the Refugees for Justice.
Okay. Where have you gone?
So I just left the job. Now I'm managing a small business for a friend.
Okay. How was your own experience of being an asylum seeker?
Looking at it now, I was quite lucky. But then it was as harsh as it could be when I was in the system. And it was during the time when Honourable Lady Theresa May was, I think, the Home Secretary at the time, if I recollect that. And you would have been put into your accommodation after very quickly, rapidly, almost like 2-3 days after your arrival, and you would receive some money. It wasn't through cards. You would have, you would get a letter. You go to the post office. You receive it, and the housing condition over there at that time was still not good and not adequate at all.
Okay. Now, in your professional capacity, how long have you been either working for Refugees for Justice, and I think you say before that you were a volunteer for others? How does in your view, how does the experience of recent asylum seekers, recently arrived asylum seekers, compare to your own?
I think there is some significant difference, as I said previously, about the housing accommodation and the way people are being treated. At the current state, it's a very, very significant difference, almost unrecognizable compared to the time that I was here. In terms of the system, in terms of the laws, in terms of the housing, the support, even the public narrative.
Has it got better or worse?
Worse.
Okay. At paragraph 5, you record that the national lockdown happened on 26 March 2020, and then you talk about something that occurred shortly after.
Yes, it was on April 2020. In Glasgow, they moved 321 people seeking asylum, but they were ultimately housed in their safe community-based accommodation. They were moved to the hotels.
So tell me about the before situation, before April 2020. What was the situation then?
To my knowledge, the situation before then, people were housed in this safe base accommodation, and they were receiving support, the financial support they were getting, and they were given the right to cook for themselves, and they were almost integrating with the community and they were connecting with the community. They were based in, and some of them were registered with GP, and they had their GP, and some others were also taking education, learning the language, ESOL courses and stuff like that around their area.
Okay. Do you know what percentage of asylum seekers get to stay?
Get to stay in the UK?
Yeah.
I think the previous stat I had in my head was over 65% and above were accepted as genuine refugees.
Okay, but you weren't. You got permission to stay as a spouse.
I have, yes.
So in addition to the 65%, there will be another group of people who got permission to stay.
That's correct.
At paragraph 6, you talk about the April 2020, and at the end of that paragraph, there is a superscript, a number 1, referring to a footnote. And if we go down to the bottom of that page, it refers to Independent Commission of Inquiry into Asylum Provision in Scotland, Part 1. Now, I'm not going to take you to that at the moment because I understand you were involved in the creation of that Commission of Inquiry.
That's correct.
Can you tell me how that came to be set up?
Yes, so an incident happened in June 2020. Badruddin Abdullah Adam was an asylum seeker, were placed in a parking hotel, and he was denied mental health support after he called for mental health support over 72 times. Later we found out through the link to the BBC report. He had a mental psychotic episode and started stabbing multiple people, including 2 asylum seekers, police officers and hotel staff, and then later he was shot dead. After that, Refugees for Justice, when established, we were trying to get the government to look into this, and we were ultimately asking for a public inquiry, fair, independent public inquiry, to look into what happened, to learn a lesson, not so much about getting a verdict, but to learn a lesson. And that hasn't happened, and we were denied ultimately, and that's why we tried to commission an independent inquiry ourselves to try to look at.
When you say we tried to commission an independent inquiry ourselves, who are the we that you're talking
As Refugees for Justice, we were trying to commission an independent inquiry.
And were you able to set up that inquiry? Obviously you were.
We were, of course.
We've got the reports. Who chaired that inquiry?
Baroness Helena Kennedy, KC.
Helena Kennedy.
That's correct.
Okay. In the witness statement, you talk about paragraph 7 about, and please don't name the person, but you talk about a Syrian national. Tell me a little of that.
So I was made aware that there was somebody died in the hotel. That was the initial information that came out, but then we later found out he actually committed suicide.
And was it the combination of that death and the Mr. Adam shooting? He was shot by the police, yes?
Mr. Adam was shot by the police.
It was the combination of those 2 deaths that led Refugees for Justice to seek to set up the Helena Kennedy inquiry.
That's correct.
Okay. Are people still living for lengthy periods of time in hotels?
Yes.
Okay. At paragraph 10, you talk about something of what Refugees for Justice, which is a core participant in this inquiry, what they do. Could you tell us that?
Yes, Refugee for Justice, as I said in my previously shortly, it was set up in response to what has happened during the pandemic, and effectively the parking incident and the suicide of the individual. And we were trying to support. Initially, we were just supporting at personal capacity, supporting people in the hotel, we were collecting donations, sometimes we were giving donation, and then we formed the group. The group was formed to ask for independent inquiry and trying to get justice for those who were put in the hotel and without getting adequate support, and trying to find out what went wrong and get justice ultimately for those who died in the hotel.
And you've now got your inquiry, you've produced the report. Does Refugees for Justice continue to work? What does it do?
We still continue to fight because we haven't get the closure. That we still don't know what was the motive behind putting people into the hotel. There's still no accountability. That's why I want to mention this. We, on behalf of Refugees for Justice, I can say we thank this inquiry to allow us to be heard at least, and to put our words in. But the government and the Scottish government obviously bear no responsibility in this. The Home Office still denied to conduct a public inquiry, so our work still continues. The Refugees for Justice work still continues to get that public inquiry and get answered for Adnan and others who were died in the hotel.
And you'll be aware, obviously, that there will ultimately be a fatal accident inquiry into the death of Mr. Adam.
So that's a likely. We hear that the police saying there would likely be a fatal incident inquiry, but that hasn't happened yet, and it might take years. And the last police investigation said the shooting was ultimately was an absolute right decision, and we beg to differ.
Okay. You then talk about your volunteering experience before these events occurred. Can you tell us about that? What that experience gave you?
Yeah. So, I was also interpreting for a company called Clear Voice. In my capacity in that, supporting literally asylum seekers and refugees when they're moved from house to house and daily issues. But then I was also involved in an organization called Zagros Community. It's a Kurdish organization operating mainly in Glasgow. We were supporting people. Before the pandemic, the group were organizing events and helping Kurdish people ultimately to integrate into the society. And during the pandemic, they changed course, started helping people, cooking for people, and giving vouchers from donors to asylum seekers in the hotel.
Okay. Now, before that, I think you say at paragraph 18 that you had been a professional freelance interpreter.
That's correct.
Tell us about that work.
So I was, as I said, I was a freelance interpreter for Clear Voice at the time, and I was interpreting for mainly asylum seekers and refugees.
And which languages did you interpret?
Kurdish, Sorani to English.
Right. And when Helena Kennedy was gathering evidence, were you involved as an interpreter in that?
It wasn't during that time. We were collecting evidence. Refugees for Justice were collecting evidence before commissioning Baroness Helena Kennedy. But yes, I was with one of the founders of Refugees for Justice. He approached me and he asked me to help him to interpret.
Okay. Paragraph 19, you talk about something about the philosophy of Refugees for Justice. Can you tell us about that? Yeah,
we believe, in our experience, we believe every human being should be treated equal regardless of legal status and social status. And the fact that we are here, that means that actually doesn't happen in reality. So we're trying to achieve that point.
Okay. Paragraph 20, you talk about the move from flats into hotels. Was your organisation notified officially by anyone that was going to happen?
No. No, I'm aware of, no.
Do you know from your contacts with other third sector agencies whether they were notified of it?
No.
When people were moved, did they require to rely on third sector agencies to supply them with materials?
By large.
such as?
Such as, well, as I said, food and clothes and phone top-ups and trainers, jackets, things like that.
Okay, and none of the statutory agencies were providing those things?
No.
Now, at the point at which an individual is being moved from a flat into a hotel, firstly, how long may they have been living in the flat?
I mean, obviously, it depends on the individual, but by large, people were there at least, 6 months and over.
Right. And we've heard evidence and seen material which indicate that before accommodation is changed, an individual should be interviewed to check for vulnerabilities.
So this, I believe what has happened and what MERS relied on before moving people into the hotel, the screening interview, the initial interview when someone arrived to the UK, they ask you whether you have any health problem.
Okay. As you probably know, I'm quite familiar with that system. Let me ask you about that.
Sure.
Screening interview, as I understand it, well, maybe you can explain it. When is a screening interview normally carried out?
So the minute you arrive to the UK, you're probably, in a matter of 24 hours, you will have a screening interview.
And during the course of that interview, are you asked, and I'm quoting here, do you have any health problems?
You'll be asked that, yes.
Right. And then when it comes to moving accommodation, that might be how long after you've had your screening interview?
It could be 1 year, it could be 2 years. It could be, a significant long period of time, definitely.
And when that happens, presumably it's perfectly possible that an individual's circumstances might have altered significantly.
Of course, and I also want to mention that when on my experience, my own experience, when I came here, they asked me, "Do you have any health problem?" I was not comfortable to talk about the health problem I had. Later, after 2 years, I found out I had a severe PTSD. I found out myself 2 years going through so many process, long assessments. So I don't think it's an easy thing, specifically in terms of mental health, for someone with mental health to say, oh yes, I've got mental health. So I think that question in itself requires this assessment, not just asking a question and say yes or no.
And when people arrive in the UK, sometimes that's at an airport, but other times it's in the back of a lorry or now no longer in the back of a lorry, that's stopped, but boats are a common way. For people in that situation, are they always able to be open and upfront about answering questions such as, do you have any health problems at that stage?
Absolutely not. People would be terrified coming out a small boat, and they just arrive. I don't think they're comfortable at all to say anything, let alone talk about their health problems.
And who is it that conducts screening interviews? Is it a psychologist, a health worker? Is it a social worker?
I think it's just an immigration officer.
An immigration officer.
That's correct.
So you understand MERS relied on a historic self-assessment of health problems in order that they could assess vulnerabilities at the time of a move. Is that fair to say, summarising your evidence?
Yes, I'll try to be fair to MERS to say that's what they rely on. They might have relied on nothing at all as well. Might be a possibility.
Were people given notice that they might move?
A very, very short notice. Some of them were given half an hour notice, some of them 2 hours notice. And they were told to pack up one bag with you, and sometimes the MERS officer would be wait outside for the individual to be moved.
When people arrived at the hotels, well, no, can you tell me about the mechanism by which they were transported? How did they get to the hotels that they were being moved to?
I think, well, no, they use different methods, but ultimately by car. They will hire a car and would go and pick them up. And most of the times, to my knowledge, it's a minivan. And it's not just one person. They will gather 4 or 5 people from different locations, and that's how that's the mechanism they use.
Would people be told where they were going?
No.
Not at all?
No, at all. They would say they would be moved to a safer place. And when I had conversation with people, they would say they didn't even know where they would be going, for how long they would stay, and what's happening and why they've been moved. Very little communication took place at the time.
Okay. I'll ask you a bit more about the hotels in a moment, but when people arrived at the hotels, what was the reception system like in the hotel?
I think I don't have much knowledge about the reception, whether they were welcomed or not, but I feel like the environment, the atmosphere was created, and I know from people when I had a conversation with, they were terrifying, and there was a rumors among asylum seekers themselves that they say, we've been targeted. They actually want to kill us. They actually want to kill us because the COVID's going on and everyone is terrifying. This is the infectious virus, and now they put us all into this overcrowded place. They want to kill us.
And was there a perception that the hotels were overcrowded?
Yes.
I'm going to ask you about food and so on later.
Sure.
But in terms, what happened to? Let me ask you this first. When people were in the flats, did they receive financial support?
Yes, they were.
How much?
I think it was about £35, something, £36.
A week?
That's correct.
And when they moved to hotels, what happened to that money?
Well, that was 3 tiers, schemes, I would call. A scheme when people were receiving absolutely nothing at all in the hotel. Some group of people, which was the larger group of people were receiving £8 a week. And some others, they were still receiving £35.
Mm. And do you know if that was deliberate or just inefficiency?
I think it was just the mismanagement, the whole process. Mm-hmm.
In terms of people who were getting nothing at all, how did they get food and so on?
So they were supplied food by the hotel.
And I'll ask you about that in a bit more detail in a moment. But how did they collect their food within the hotel?
So they have to queue up, like the prison-like condition. You would queue up and you wait with your tray and get your food.
Was there an opportunity to socially isolate when that was happening?
Absolutely not. Was
there a specific time that people had to go to collect food?
Yes, breakfast, lunch and dinner time.
And did everyone go together?
Yes.
In your experience? Yes,
because there's a time limit. If you don't pick up your food around a particular time, then you might have no food at all.
Okay. What about if someone was self-isolating?
So that was one of the main issues. There was misunderstanding what self-isolating in the first place in the asylum community. People were in a hotel. Some of them were. I know the people came to me. They said, "We know individual who got COVID, but he's not self-isolating, or you might not understand it. It's not deliberate. He's coming down the stairs and queuing up for the food and then going back to his room, and he think that's a self-isolation." And they were telling me like there was also no a particular monitoring system when somebody caught COVID and remain in the hotel and making sure that this individual is not coming outside and entering the crowd while receiving food and stuff like that.
Mr. Adam, who was shot by the police, do you know if he had been self-isolating?
Yes, to my knowledge, he was.
Tell me about that.
So, well, I later found out through people that he contracted with the virus, and he was self-isolating for 21 days on row, and he wasn't out at all. So the hotel staff would knock the door and give him the food, and they leave the food outside the door, and he would come and pick up.
Did you know Mr. Adam?
No, not at the personal level.
Right. Do you know if he spoke English?
I think he has some English language, yes, to my knowledge.
What happened if there was an outbreak in a hotel?
I think that was the mechanism they followed at the moment. So, like, an individual would be self-isolating if that was their intention, to put individual in their room and say self-isolate in your room, but still in the hotel.
You spoke about there being rumours, if we can put it that way, amongst the residents in hotels that the government were trying to kill them. What happened when vaccinations were introduced?
That rumour even doubled down, right? Because there's it's a cultural, maybe educational, or even the culture of distrust in authorities in the first place. They felt like they were targeted. First, because the hotel, they found out the hotel was shut to the public, and due to public concern, health concern. So they said, okay, if it is not safe for the public, why is it safe for us? So that's why there was a rumor, and then that started. And then when the vaccine situation came, they said, oh, they want to vaccinate us now. So they put us in the hotel, and now they want to vaccinate us. That's definitely, confirmed what we initially thought. So that's what was going on.
And did you do something to try to assuage those fears?
Yes, I mean, at the individual, at a personal capacity I have, but also I think Zagros community organization also invited a doctor, as I believe they have, and through Zoom call, he was speaking about how safe the vaccine is and encouraging people to take up the vaccine. So
one of the community organizations got a doctor essentially to speak to residents in a particular hotel.
That's what I've heard, yes.
Was that more widespread than that one hotel?
I think that was one-off thing, just for a small group of Kurdish people, I think.
Did you translate for that? Or?
No.
No, right.
Because I think that the doctor was Kurdish himself, I think. That's what I've heard.
Right. Now, during the time that people were resident in hotels, we heard at the beginning the Home Office were relying on screening interviews. During the time they were in the hotel, once the immediate heat had gone out of the 320 transfers, did they do anything about checking for vulnerabilities at that stage?
No.
Nothing at all?
Nothing at all.
And so far as you are aware, from your experience, were there people who had been moved to hotels that you would consider had vulnerabilities?
Yes.
Such as?
We have people with severe mental health problem. And I just wanted to point this out because I think I couldn't in a previous answer. Asylum seekers, by definition, in my opinion, they are vulnerable in terms of mental health support. They need mental health support immediately when they arrive because of the journey they take, because of the issues they flee from, and because of the asylum system in itself. There's three highly likely points that any individual, ordinary person go through those three stages. I can guarantee you they will need mental health support. So on that basis, they are vulnerable at the first stage. So there should be assessment at least, if not considered as vulnerable, but there should be assessment, and there was no assessment done by the MERS.
And when the opportunity arose subsequently to carry out assessments, was that opportunity taken?
No, they were ignored. Just in the case of the individual was shot dead by the police.
Now, we're going to hear evidence later today, I think, from an individual who will talk about the barriers to asylum seekers accessing healthcare. Do you want to say something about that?
A few things about it. Just one of them, the issue of accessing to GP. Asylum seekers were denied to access GP or register in a general practitioner for a few reasons. One of them was the address. They didn't have a long-term address and a ARC asylum registration card.
Okay, let me break that down a little. Why was it, when people were moved to hotels, can you say roughly where the hotels were? Were they all in close proximity to one another?
It was around city centre.
So they were the 6 hotels that they were moved to were all around Glasgow city centre.
Roughly.
Where had they previously lived?
So it was in different places, East End, all around Glasgow. So it wasn't one specific place, or they were not placed in around city centre in general. So just any accommodation around Glasgow, people were put in. Because at that time, Glasgow was the only city where asylum seekers, accepting asylum seekers.
Right, and so if someone was living for up to a year or longer in the East End of Glasgow, one would have expected them to sort out a GP there.
That's correct.
Which might be 5 miles from where the hotel was.
That's correct.
Do you know from your experience whether the Home Office or mayors made contact with local GPs to say there's a group of new arrivals coming in?
I have no knowledge of if they ever done something like this.
Okay. Would you be surprised if they did?
I would be surprised, yes, very, very surprised.
Was it only single people who were moved from hotels to
No, there were families as well.
with children?
I think so, yes.
What was the difficulty with, or was there a difficulty with registering a GP if you were with a new GP if you were staying in a hotel?
That's correct, because the hotels initially was not considered as a long-term address. It wasn't long residency. They were still considered as a hotel. So they needed a long-term address. The GPs did as individuals. And the second point was about the asylum registration card.
Right. So tell us about asylum registration cards.
So this card, I just wanted to point out, the ARC card is when you arrive to the UK. In my time, it was almost immediately you'll be issued with the ID card. But that luxury has gone. Now you have to wait 3 months, 4 months, 5 months, sometimes 6 months. And it depends, arbitrarily, you need to have that ID card, the only photo ID card that you would have in the UK, which is issued by the Home Office.
And why is having that card important?
To register with GP, and if the police stops you, you have an ID to show. And to register with the college, you would need that ID. And then I just want to say, so the issue with that, many people were not issued the ARC. So when they were going to the GP were saying, we need photo ID. The GP was not aware of the Scottish Government policy, and the individual did know as well. So that's why I later had to, at my personal capacity, email the First Minister of Scotland, Nicola Sturgeon, then.
Right. So there was a problem with people registering with GPs, and that related to the fact that they weren't in settled accommodation and they didn't have ARC cards.
That's correct.
Okay. And you wrote to the First Minister. And
Yes.
what happened as a result of writing to the First Minister? So
the First Minister office responded to me. Probably you get the emails. I don't know if you will get in evidence. I wrote to the First Minister. I explained the difficulty people facing during the pandemic. They need to be registered with GP, and they come back to me. They said the policy, their policy is GP must and should register anyone without needing a photo ID. It's an optional thing. It's good to have a photo ID, but it's not a must. So that's when I found out that there is a lack of information sharing among the Scottish Government and the general practitioner, and also maybe the individuals themselves were not aware of that policy. Maybe that policy was not clear enough.
And were you able to copy that letter to give to people who were having difficulties in registering with GPs?
I have, through verbally, I've explained to people because people had difficulty reading and writing in English.
Okay. Now, tell me about the food in hotels.
Oh, the food was so bad. It was so undignified. I've been receiving pictures. Then I was receiving pictures almost at a daily basis. Uncooked rice, rotten chicken, and culturally inappropriate foods to people. I just felt so. It hurt me so much because when I was myself in the system, I remember I had. At least I had the dignity to cook for myself and eat, and just have the option to cook what I like. That was the only option I had at the time when I was there. But then that choice was taken away from people in the asylum system. During the time that you're thinking about whether you're going to catch COVID, whether you're going to die, whether you're ever going to see your loved ones, and at that moment of time, additional pressures come to you. You've been shoved a food that you don't like. It's not what you eat, and it was so undignified to a point. And taking the levers, the option that you can go out and buy food, the financial support, that was being taken away from them as well. So it was horrific. It was so undignified.
What was the response of Mears or the hotel to complaints about the quality of food?
I mean, initially it was so arrogant about it. And then later on, so arrogant. They were quite reluctant to change. And then there was hunger strike. And then Mears start listening to people changing their menus. That's what they done.
Why did they have to change the menus?
Because it wasn't good. It wasn't good enough and wasn't culturally appropriate. And they were quite new to this. They put in multiple nationality into a hotel and trying to cook something that is common among all of them. It's a very difficult thing to do, and of course, and then they start listening and changing the menus. But it was still a problem. You can never cook something. I mean, my wife is Scottish. If she cooks something to me, I might eat it. But if I bring my cousins and my dad and a few of my Sudanese friends into a house, she cannot make them all happy. Mm-hmm. So that's just a simple fact.
You spoke about the difficulty because of the lack of funding. If lunch was uncooked chicken in part, how would people get food?
There was no alternative. There was no alternative. You have to wait for dinner and hope that the dinner would be better than lunch.
And some had no money, some had £5 a week. Is that what you said?
£8 a week, yes.
£8 a week.
That's correct.
And do you know how long it was intended that people would stay in hotels?
There was no knowledge. Mears Group were not telling anybody how long people should stay, and the individual themselves didn't know how long they stay in that situation.
So people would need to be thinking about clothing, haircuts, etc., with what little money they had.
That's correct.
What about internet? Was there internet in the hotels?
I think there was internet in the hotel. There was Wi-Fi, but when people would go for walk and stuff like that, they didn't have top up in their phone. So that's why Refugees Protested and many other organisations, like Medical Integration, Scottish Refugee Council, many other organisations, like Zagro's community organisation, they were providing vouchers, top-up vouchers.
What was the concern? If I'm an asylum seeker in a hotel in the Park Inn, why am I concerned about going out for a walk and not having access to Wi-Fi?
I mean, it's terrifying to say that. It's a horrific scene. I want to be away from it. I just want to go for a walk. I just want to be away from the whole situation. And that's why people would want to go out. And those people didn't have the proper knowledge about the Glasgow city in itself. They would need to use map, GPS, whatever they have at that time, and communicate with their family. Just share. Just need someone to talk to what they've been through. And I think they didn't have top-up, and that was a very difficult thing. I cannot imagine to be in that position.
Paragraph 36, you recount an experience of going for a walk with an asylum seeker.
Yes, I know. So I was walking.
Tell us about that.
Yeah, it's very emotional because I was walking with this guy a few times. I was taking them out as a group. And I know that they don't have money, and I know that, and I know there's something about feeling embarrassed to ask for money and feeling ashamed to ask, oh, let me get a drink or something that's just so hard, so difficult to ask for. So I sometimes go for a walk with them. I just say, oh, can you wait there? I'm just going to go in that shop. I'll pick up a drink or two. I'll just get them, multiple drinks and just share. I say, no, you can take it. And then this guy, we walked past a burger shop, a takeaway shop, and he literally stopped by and said, what I've been dreaming of for a while. I was like, what you've been dreaming of? Just to get a burger and a drink. So that was someone's dream, to have a burger and a drink.
Paragraph 37, you talk about that kind of experience. Tell us a bit more about that.
Say it again, sorry.
37. It's talking about vulnerable to social isolation due to COVID without access to phones or methods of communication.
Yeah, it was, as I said, during the pandemic actually shows how important communication is, how important relationship is. And the methods people used to use was seeing each other face to face. And that method's been taken away from people. And the alternative was phone. Actually, ultimately, what you had, it was phone. And people were not provided the support they need to top up the internet and having their phones with them to communicate with their family, their friends. And I think that added I would say not a little bit, but a significant amount of mental pressure on individuals who were isolating in a place like that, seeing the horrific scene of parking incident. They're not able to communicate with their friends and family. They're not able to see their friends and family face to face, and they do not know how long they should stay. And I think that added a lot of pressure. But if you want me to talk about the point after, when the Scottish Government actually stepped in and introduced...
That's exactly what I was going to ask you about. You talk in paragraph 37 about that situation altering.
Yes, and when the Scottish Government actually perhaps seen the gap, they didn't discriminate asylum seekers and refugees as usually asylum seekers and refugees have been discriminated. And this project called Connecting Scotland, they were providing tablets, laptops and dongles with internet for a year. And I managed to apply for some Zagros organizations, a volunteer, and Refugees for Justice did also, and I think many other organizations did. And I just want to share one feedback, credit to Scottish Government, from a disabled family. I do not want to name them. A disabled family of 4, I think. They had one phone and without internet. And this individual were put in a place their kids didn't know how to entertain them. They're disabled, they can't walk, they can't do as much as ordinary parents could do because of their physical disability. So that when we provided the laptop and the dongle and the children and the glowing face and the smile on their face, it changed my. It brings a positive vibe to me that still lives with me to the day. I was so happy they managed to watch something on YouTube, a simple thing like that made a significant change. And I think that's credit to that project.
Maybe they're watching you now on YouTube.
Possibly, hopefully so.
You spoke, I asked you questions earlier about health service access. I forgot to ask you something. After the park-in incident, was there any move made to ensure that people who had witnessed the incident received mental health support of any kind from Mears or the Home Office or anyone else?
No at all. Because I just want to say one thing about this. We have tried to ask, and the individual asked Mears Group to get some mental health support. But what unfortunately Mears Group is saying, they are not mental health provider. They're just a housing maintenance, as if they're dealing with boilers and fridge. But they actually have human being in care. And if you provide a service to a human being, you should be able to provide the necessity that human being needs, such as a mental health support. You can't just let people people say, hey, I can only take the profit away from you. When it comes to profit, it's my stuff, I deal with it. But when it comes to the needs, fill in the gap, I'll leave it for the third sector, as refugees, but there's many other organizations providing mental health support.
Slow down.
Sorry,
say that
a bit
again.
emotional.
That's fine. Say that again, but say it more slowly.
Yeah, so Mirrors Group are actually washing their hand of the responsibility that they have to provide mental health support. There has been request, the Mirrors Group, in the independent inquiry, Helena Barron and Helena Kennedy asked them that they should allocate £5 million at least in the budget to provide mental health support. They haven't done so. They're saying they deny, and they are just a housing provider, just a maintenance, as if they're dealing with dealing with fridge and sofas and boilers. They actually have human being in their care, and they should be responsible to provide the necessity that human being needs in their care.
Okay, paragraph 38, you talk about the demography of the people who were in the hotels, and then you move, and we will note that. But we then move on, and you make reference to the mother and baby unit, and we heard evidence earlier in relation to the mother and baby unit. What do you want to say about that unit?
So I was at a personal capacity again. I was supporting a few mothers at that mother and baby unit, and they sent me pictures of the place. It was so tiny, and one of the mothers was saying, I cannot close my eyes. I have to be vigilant 24/7 because the kitchen is right next to me, and my baby could, may crawl and just, do something, harm themselves. And the mothers were so isolated, and that there were also a few other issues about sanitary products. I think AMMA, they've provided good support, and other organisations as well. So. What
was the problem with sanitary products?
There was not much sanitary product, not just in the mother and baby unit, but also among other hotels, or when there was a sanitary product, they were given to the male receptionist often. So the woman should go and ask a male receptionist, say, I need a sanitary product.
Okay. You summarise much of what you say at paragraph 39. I don't need to get you to read that, but I want to move on to ask you a little bit about the Helena Kennedy report.
Of course.
There are two Helena Kennedy, or the report is in two parts. At the middle bottom of each page there is pagination. Can I take you to page 10? Yes?
Yes.
And you'll see that it's in two columns. Can I ask you to start to read the left-hand column just below the box, which the part which is highlighted in the left-hand column?
Are you referring to...
And yet.
And yet.
Yeah, if you could read that.
Of course. And yet all of these 321 were moved to one of 6 hotels in the city with no notice, no explanation, and no induction to their circumstances. Cash support was entirely removed on arrival at the hotels, and no individualized health or vulnerability assessment were done prior to or during the course of these moves, despite repeated warning from hotel residents themselves and the organizations supporting them about difficulties being experienced. 2 tragedies then occurred. In May 2020, Adnan OB died due to the suspected suicide in one of the hotels. 1 month later, in June 2020, what has become known as the Parkin tragedy took place. Badruddin Abdullah Adam, who had sought help 72 times due to his deteriorating mental health, was shot dead by police during stabbing attacks. 6 people, including 3 asylum seekers, 1 police officer, 2 staff members, were injured, and many were traumatized.
On page 23 in that part of the report, we see at the bottom right a paragraph under the heading needs risk and safeguarding assessments. Could you read that paragraph?
Of course. No one of the 41 people who gave formal statement to Refugees for Justice could recount having been asked questions about their health at the time of the move.
And then over the page, there's a quote.
This is a quote, "I was moved to the new hotel by taxi. I had some time to gather my things. I was never asked any questions about my health before I was moved. Since being here, no one has asked to check if I'm okay. I have a headache and a sore back, but I don't know who to contact."
And there's then 4 bullet points further down, talking about the vulnerability of the 41 who gave evidence to the Helena Kennedy inquiry. Could you go through those bullet points, please?
Of course. At least 6 people were victims of torture or inhuman treatment. 27 out of 41 people indicated that they had pre-existing mental health conditions. 23 out of 41 people indicated that they had pre-existing physical health condition ranging in severity from headaches and back pain to epilepsy and diabetes. 14 people indicated that they experienced poor physical and mental health.
Okay, can you turn over to page 25, the next page, and the bottom left column, or the bottom of the left-hand column, headed food.
Sure. Each individual statement, regardless of the hotel they have been placed in, noted that the food provided was inadequate, poorly prepared, often inedible. Each statement also made clear that the arrangement for eating were either overly restrictive or so poorly enforced that the act of eating made feel they were being put at risk of contracting COVID-19. These accounts are consistent across all 6 of the hotels described in the statement, indicating that this problem was not limited to one individual hotel, but was systematic. Accounts were consistent and highlight not only the poor provision, but the failures of any responsible agencies to respond to frequent complaints about it.
Could you go to page 28? And it's the top left paragraph, which is a quotation. And there's a sentence which begins, "There was nowhere."
There was nowhere, and I asked him to help. You referring to the first top left, yes?
Top left, and there's a sentence which begins about 8 lines down. "There was nowhere."
After some weeks in a place, I can't find it, sorry. Oh, there was no organization.
No, there was nowhere. On page 28.
I'm on page 28.
Oh,
okay. There was nowhere to wash our clothes at the beginning. We had to wash by hand. After some weeks, they put in place a washing machine, but all of us had to use it. We were 70 to 75 people there. I also asked them for financial support, for financial help to wash my clothes, and they said, "You have to go outside for washing them." And I said, "I have no money to wash them." And they said, "That is your problem. I need my glasses."
You do notice I'm going down, further down the same column on the left-hand side, access to independent information, advice and interpretation. Could you read the second paragraph, second sentence of that paragraph?
So those who were confident in English generally seems to fare better, feeling able to raise issues with hotel staffs and report concern to Mears Group, although they generally felt that these were not acted upon. 2 residents spoke highly of their contact with one individual member of Mears Group staff. Some resident has accessed multilingual support from migrant help with varying results. Some reported feeling that they had been assisted, whilst others felt they had not been able to access any useful assistance. Almost every person had been able to maintain contact with their legal representative whilst at the hotel, although most had done so remotely using video or phone calls due to COVID-19 health restrictions.
Could you go to page 37? And in the left-hand column, carrying on to the right-hand column, there are 5 bullet points. Can I go ask you to, we don't need the first one, but from the second one on, could you read that?
Sure. The report contains enticing language. The Home Office should consider a place-based approach. Consideration should be given to the development of a system that allows for a person-centric view of interaction across the system and identify patterns of contact that may be indicative of behaviours that may be used for concerns, but doesn't appear to propose how or when such place-based approach or person-centric view would be implemented. And the point after, the report seems to imply that NGOs and civil society organizations are always resourced and available to respond to issues as they arise. The Home Office should work closely with service users, providers, as a quote, the Home Office should work closely with service user providers, community groups and NGOs, identify and support a package of suitable on-site and local activity that people can engage with, end quote.
Okay, could you go to page 38, which is over the page, and in the left-hand column, the final paragraph begins, and this paragraph is talking about the Mother and Baby Unit. The Children and Young Persons Commission Scotland. Could you read that paragraph?
The Children and Young People's Commission Scotland in March 2022 put to the Scottish Parliament concerns as to the human rights of asylum-seeking mothers and their children aged between 0 and 2 being placed in bedsit accommodation in Glasgow by Mears. The Commission concluded that there were risks to a number of children's human rights under the UN Convention of the Right of Child, including right to inadequate standard of living, right to respect for private and family life, right to the highest attainable standard of health, and rights to leisure, play and recreations. The report stated that the process through which asylum accommodation in Glasgow is proposed, approved and delivered does not sufficiently reflect the human rights duties of the Scottish statutory bodies. It fails to include an adequate mechanism for ensuring...
That's okay. That's okay. Could you move on to the next paragraph, the bullet point in February 2022?
Sure. In February 2022, the Scottish Refugee Council put to the Scottish Social Justice and Social Security Committee that the Home Office is implementing a fait accompli, a practice whereby they reach agreement with private hoteliers and only then tell the local authority and health services that they had done such, putting the council and the local communities unfairly and needlessly on the back foot. This is irresponsible. A proper way to act would be to consult and liaise with the local authority and to respect their views and knowledge toward a genuine partnership to support new arrival in appropriate accommodation in communities, not these institutional accommodation sites, and thereby respect local communities and impact on service too. The notes of the committee meetings state that, according to the Scottish Refugee Council, that fait accompli practice being applied in Falkirk, South Lancashire, Aberdeen City, Perth and Kinroth and Edinburgh, and potentially Dundee. The result is that approximately 500 people have been moved into institutional ex-hotel asylum accommodation with no consent sought or got from the local authority, nor any direct funding either.
Okay. And then can we go over the page onto page 39? And in the second paragraph, on the left-hand column, there's a comment there from this Committee of Inquiry as early as April 2020. You see that? Could you
Yes.
read part of that paragraph?
As early as April 2020, ONS statistics were highlighting differential outcome of COVID-19. The risk of death involving the coronavirus, COVID-19, among some ethnic groups is significantly higher than of those of white ethnicity. Then, when taken into account age in analysis, black males are 4.2 times more likely to die from COVID-19 related death, and black females are 4.3 times more likely than white ethnicity male and females.
That's helpful. What was the ethnic mix in the hotels?
I think it was by large African. But we also had other groups, like Kurdish people and Arabs as well.
Yes. Can I take you to page 42? And you'll see that at the left-hand edge there are a series of arrows. Can I take you to the third arrow?
Sure.
Could you read that paragraph?
Migrant help MERS.
Sorry, I should say these are questions that are being posed by Dame Helena Kennedy's inquiry.
That's
in this report, yes.
Migrant Help, MERS on-site welfare officers, the Asylum Health Bridging Team, NGOs, and the Home Office Safeguarding Team were all supposed to support asylum seekers both proactively and reactively in hotels and self-contained accommodation, yet they did so in absence of a framework that joined those efforts and services up and did not have a system of proactive need assessment reviews built in. How did it come about that in drawing up expensive contracts and schedules and conducting lengthy negotiation before these appointments were made, no such overarching framework was devised?
Okay. Over the page to 43. And again, the left-hand column contains a series of bullet points. Can I go to the second last one?
That having, yes.
Yes.
That having this group in hotel would reduce MERS workers and asylum seekers having to make trips from service accommodation to get the £37 cash support.
So that's about, and it continues.
Yeah, that the moves were made to create the safest environment for new service users.
Tell me what an Aspen card is.
So the Aspen card is the card produced by the Home Office, which asylum seekers can receive their money through. It's like a credit card, but it calls Aspen card, and the money I used to get in a paper, then now they put it on the Aspen card.
So if they had introduced Aspen cards for people in hotels, they wouldn't have needed anyone to take money.
That's correct. That's correct.
There's then part 2 of the report, and there's only a few parts in this report that I want to take you to. Can we start at page 16?
You're running short of time, Mr. Cassidy.
Yes, I'm aware of that, my lord. Can I take you, this is findings from Dame Helena Kennedy. I'm on page 16. On the left-hand column, no, it's, the pages are side, yeah, page 16, and there's a passage. It begins with a quotation, and then there's a paragraph, and then the first bullet point on the left-hand side.
Yes.
Can you read that first bullet point?
Is that with women who had been?
Yes.
Women who had been victims of male violence, trafficking, and exploitation being placed in mixed hotel. Many women in this situation felt terrified and feared for their safety. This is a quote. We know of at least 3 instances where women whose asylum claims were either entirely based on or featured clear experience of gender-based violence were accommodated in mixed-gender hotels in Glasgow. That's the end quote. And I know at my personal level someone who was, can I just add that, a victim of sex and raped and sexual assault multiple times on the way to the UK, but they were put in a hotel among other males.
I'm looking at page 19 now, and in the right-hand column, the first paragraph. the health impacts of a sudden move?
The health impacts of sudden move are striking and clear. No thought seems to have been given to what it could mean for someone who has fled persecution, lived in fear, and experienced trauma to be rounded up and moved against their will and robbed of all agency or control. In terms of mental health, and most accounts were here suggested this deteriorated rapidly and to worrying depth. We had an account from family who were told they had an hour to pack up and leave their home of 3 years, and when they had become popular and active members of the local community, the isolation, lack of control, accommodation, and unfamiliar and inadequate surrounding language difficulties, social adjustment, and uncertainty about what the future held. This had a harmful impact on people's mental health.
And can I take you now to the penultimate passage, or the last passage in this document, and I just have one more passage to take you to page 23. And in the left-hand column of page 23, could you read the beginning of the second bullet point?
Likely furthering the culture, that's correct. Likely furthering the culture of fear, mere staff enter rooms and property at will without warning, often letting themselves in. The impact that this has on the lives of well-being of people from whom Mears is caring is hugely detrimental. For people in the UK can imagine that it must be like to know that a closed and locked door doesn't mean privacy. Extraordinarily, the panel witnessed firsthand an example of this during a digital evidence session when a member of Mears staff let themselves into a property of one of the participants on the call and started wandering about without even having knocked, nor apparently having identified themselves before entering.
After they had concluded hearing evidence, generally, the Kennedy inquiry had a listening day where people went in and gave individual evidence, focused in particular in respect of the Parkin incident. Could I take you to that document and the page that includes paragraph 3.3?
Paragraph, sorry.
And it's the paragraph, can we go to the top of that page? Yep. And this is talking about the day, someone recounting the recollection of what happened on the day of the Parkin incident. Could you read that paragraph?
Yes. But I didn't.
On.
Yes, that's the quotation. But I didn't say, "Hi, bro." He didn't usually speak to me. I was surprised. One guy from Mears was watching us from a window. He, Bajadin, stabbed me near the stairs where we ate. I was waiting for a friend to go for a smoke. He, Bajadin, was just here. He doesn't speak to me usually. He stabbed me. He started doing this to me. He bashes his stomach and chest. Despite being injured, he managed to leave the hotel building. This is a quote again, I crossed the road to see the hotel chef. He came. I had 2 wounds. Here he points. He, the chef, got my intensities. They were intestines. Sorry. They were on the outside and on the other side. The chef was very cool. He recalled that the chef resigned from his job 2 days later.
I'll stop there. Those are all the questions I have for you. Is there anything else that we haven't covered that you need to say?
Thank you very much again for the opportunity. I just wanted to mention one thing. I think during my time and as an experience working in the field and working in Scotland particularly, it posed a further difficulty, because when we're trying to ask the Scottish Government to make improvement in the system, in this case during the COVID pandemic, when we're trying to engage with the Scottish Government ultimately saying this is the responsibility to the Home Office. And I think I just want to point this out, that Scotland has New Scots integration strategy, which also defines asylum seekers as New Scots. If asylum seekers are also being treated as Scots, ultimately New Scots, they should be also, the Scottish Government also need to have some responsibility to at least housing and health and well-being, because what happened during the pandemic, if Scotland was ultimately responsible, local authority were responsible of putting people in the hotel, I believe so, I genuinely believe so, Bajadine would have been alive today, would have been with us today, his family would have still been in touch with him, and 2 of my colleagues wouldn't be stabbed, and many other of my colleagues wouldn't suffer the mental health they were suffering. And also the last thing I want to say, when a service involves human being, like dealing with asylum seekers, and when we are at the worst possible of our humanity, namely the pandemic, we need human beings to come together to support each other. The Scottish Government need to learn the lesson, or to be aware that even in the worst time of human suffering, there are still corporations trying to exploit and profit on that moment of time, and Scottish Government should stand up for it and look after its New Scots and refugees and asylum seekers in his hand more.
Thank you very much. Thank you, my Lord.
Thank you, Mr. Qadir. Again, we're slightly ahead of the schedule that was printed. I'll have a word to see if we can possibly start a little bit earlier, hopefully at around about 12:15, but it may be that we can't start, so I beg your pardon, 1:15. It may be we can't start to 1:30, but I'll check after we've gone off.
Thank you, my Lord.
Thank you very much.